Blood can be washed away, witnesses can be bought, and justice. In Hollywood, it was often treated as a luxury. This is the accusation raised by film critics against a glamorous yet ruthless golden age where fame was molded through deception. Behind the velvet curtain stood the fixers' men, whose sole purpose was to bend the truth to protect studio profits. Within that invisible grip of control, tragedy no longer stayed on the page. It unfolded in real life, a child pushed forward as a human shield for adult fame. A revered mother willing to sacrifice her own child's body to conceal a shameful past. And a public icon of laughter who wielded silent intimidation to force a young woman into a choice with no escape. We admire monuments of fame, but do we have the courage to look into the forbidden shadows where actresses were turned into chemical experiments and dreams were built on total exploitation? Let us rewind time and peel back the first mask where an empire was willing to spend a fortune to make a queen's inconvenient past disappear. Don't forget to follow so you won't miss this journey uncovering 15 shocking truths. Permez, Joan Crawford, an adult film past, and MGM's total purge. When Joan Crawford is mentioned, the world immediately envisions a queen of elegance, razor-sharp eyebrows, commanding shoulders, and steely roles that left audiences breathless. But before the name, Joan Crawford became immortal. Hollywood whispered about a woman named Lucille Lesueur, a struggling nightclub dancer who was willing to do anything to escape poverty. And that anything became the nightmare MGM, later spent a fortune to bury beneath history's ashes. A controversial early film from her pre-stardom years. Rewind to the early 1920s. Lucille was just another young woman drifting through smoke-filled clubs, dancing to exhaustion for a few dollars to buy bread. In that desperation, the most damaging rumors closed in on her claims that she had appeared in an underground adult-themed film titled Velvet Lips. At that moment, the young woman had no real choices. It was survival, long before fame ever arrived. When she caught the attention of studio boss Louis B. Mayer, Lucille's fate changed forever. But MGM did not want a dancer with a compromised past. They wanted a flawless goddess. The name Joan Crawford was created along with a perfectly cleansed biography, a refined young lady untouched by scandal. The studio reshaped her, forcing her to live inside a fabricated identity and deny her former self completely. But the past is a ghost that rarely lets go. As Joan climbed higher, the old film resurfaced like a ticking bomb threatening to burn everything down. Eddie Mannix, Sunny. MGM's infamous fixer moved immediately. A ruthless purge was activated. $100,000 flowed through the shadows to track down and destroy every copy. Illegal theaters were raided overnight, original reels thrown into secret furnaces, erasing all evidence that Lucille Lesueur had ever existed. The cruelest blow came from her own bloodline. During her honeymoon in 1935 with Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Joan received anonymous threats. In her 1962 memoir, she recalled bitterly, "Two men claimed they possessed a stag film of me dancing. They wanted to sell it back to me." Tragically, the orchestrator of the blackmail was her own brother, Hal Lesueur. To him, Joan was not a sister to protect, but a resource to exploit without mercy. Faced with the collapse of its empire, MGM issued a chilling ultimatum: family or the throne. Joan chose fame. The studio used its power to isolate Hal completely, forcing him to vanish from her life as if he had never existed. This control was so severe that when Joan left MGM in 1943, she was reportedly required to sign a $50,000 check to repay the earlier silence fee. The name, Lucille Lesueur, was permanently buried so that the legend of Joan Crawford could shine. She reached the summit with bleeding feet, becoming an immortal icon and a prisoner inside a gilded cage. 2. Clark Gable and Loretta Young, a secret child behind the adoption performance. They were worshipped as the king and the saint, yet the greatest performance of their lives was not on screen, but a moral illusion that deceived the world for half a century. In 1935, on the frozen set of The Call of the Wild, a forbidden relationship ignited between two of Hollywood's most powerful figures. Clark Gable was the married king of Hollywood, while Loretta Young was the devout saint, an icon of purity. The pregnancy sent shockwaves through Fox and MGM, a financial catastrophe, violating morality clauses and threatening to destroy million-dollar careers. An intricate cover story was written immediately by Loretta and her mother. Loretta vanished from public view under the excuse of a mysterious illness, secretly hiding away to give birth. The cruelty began the moment the child Judy entered the world. Instead of her mother's arms, she was sent directly to an orphanage. Imagine the cruelty, one of the world's biggest stars secretly visiting her own child through iron gates, unable to claim her, waiting only for the next act of the performance. 19 months later, Loretta summoned the press and announced she had decided to adopt a poor orphaned girl. America praised the saint's compassion, unaware she was publicly adopting her own daughter to preserve her reputation. But genetics do not lie. As Judy grew older, her distinctive ears, unmistakably inherited from Clark Gable, became impossible to ignore. Hollywood noticed. This living evidence threatened to tear the lie apart. To erase it, Loretta committed an act of cruelty disguised as love. She forced her young daughter to undergo painful cosmetic surgery to alter her appearance and remove all traces linking her to the king. Judy grew up with an altered body and a stolen identity. Clark Gable visited his daughter only once. No embrace, no acknowledgement. Only the cold distance of a man who chose career over blood. Judy learned the truth at 23, just before her wedding, when her fiancé said, "You really don't know. Everyone knows you're Clark Gable's daughter." The velvet curtain finally fell in 1994 when Judy Lewis published Uncommon Knowledge, exposing the lifelong pain of a child treated as a stain to be hidden. Clark Gable and Loretta Young preserved their reputations, but forever lost the moral right to be called parents. 3. Charlie Chaplin, the cruel shadow behind the glory of the Clown King. If Charlie Chaplin were alive in the 21st century, in the era of the Me Too movement, he would be sitting behind bars instead of standing on an Oscar stage. That blunt assessment came from a child rights advocate. Because the romanticized love stories built by the press were not tender novels at all, but a dark record of disturbing patterns involving girls far younger than society would ever deem appropriate. Look closely at the list of his so-called muses, and one chilling common factor emerges: age. His first wife, Mildred Harris, wore a wedding ring at 16. His second wife, Lita Gray, walked down the aisle at 15. His final wife, Una O'Neill, became Mrs. Chaplin at 18 when he was already 54. These rushed marriages functioned less as love stories and more as legal shields, transforming deeply problematic conduct into what appeared on paper as family matters. The most unsettling truth lies in the 42-page divorce file of his second wife, Lita Gray. It was not merely a legal document, but a stark personal record exposing the darkest corners of the Clown King's private life. In its pages, Lita described long, distressing nights in which she felt coerced into fulfilling demands that violated basic moral boundaries. What emerged was not the innocent tramp of the screen, but a man driven by control and humiliation toward a much younger partner. The moment that chills readers the most is Chaplin's reaction when Lita, shaking, told him she was expecting a child. There was no joy, no comfort. Instead, he silently went to a cabinet, placed a cold object on the table in front of his 15-year-old wife, and delivered a suggestion as ruthless as it was final, that she should handle the situation herself. He did not offer a cradle to welcome life, but a brutal escape from responsibility. Yet fame washed everything clean. The media of the time chose not to defend the vulnerable, but to bow before power. Ink was used to soften reality, turning desperate cries into romantic anecdotes, labeling exploitation as artistic temperament, and reframing predatory behavior as poetic age-gap romance. 4. George Reeves, The Mysterious Death of Superman. A man takes his own life, yet is calm enough to carefully wipe all fingerprints off the gun before collapsing to the floor. That is the absurd, almost laughable scenario that the police wanted the entire world to believe about the death of the legendary Superman, George Reeves. When the case file was closed with the brief two-word conclusion, "Suicide," the evidence at the scene inside the house at 1579 Benedict Canyon was screaming a completely different story, one of a clumsily staged execution. Take a closer look at these silent but deceitful pieces of evidence. First, the Luger pistol found lying right beneath George Reeves's feet was completely clean, without a single fingerprint. Logically speaking, this is impossible. Second, the shell casing was discovered trapped beneath his back. According to basic physics, a casing should be ejected sideways when a gun is fired. Its position under his body strongly suggests that the corpse was moved by someone afterward. And most suspicious of all was the so-called 45-minute gap. From the moment the gunshot rang out until the police were finally called, what were the people inside the house, including George's fiancée, doing for nearly an entire hour? Were they simply paralyzed by fear, or were they busy rearranging everything to fit a pre-written script? All of these contradictions point to a far more chilling hypothesis. This was not the release of a despairing man, but a punishment carried out by the underworld. The question then becomes who was powerful enough to silence witnesses and blind the police so completely. Every trail leads back to Eddie Mannix MGM's infamous fixer, the man who held the power of life and death over Hollywood, whom we mentioned in Part 1. The tragedy stemmed from a taboo mistake George Reeves dared to make. He slept with the boss's wife, and then had the audacity to abandon her. This is the critical point that establishes the motive for murder. The affair itself was something Eddie Mannix had deliberately turned a blind eye to for many years. But when George decided to dump Toni Mannix to pursue a younger lover, he unknowingly insulted the pride of a crime family patriarch. For a man like Eddie, his wife having an affair could be tolerated, but having his wife emotionally destroyed by a mere actor was an unforgivable affront to his honor. Because of that fear, the funeral of Superman took place under a suffocating silence. No one dared to speak up and demand justice under the shadow of the Mannix family. It took decades before Toni Mannix herself finally confessed in anguish. George did not commit suicide. He had an accident. That statement stands as the most painful indirect confirmation of a death sentence carried out by the underworld, a world where even the life of a superstar was worth no more than trash when weighed against the honor of a powerful boss. 5. Lana Turner, The Bedroom. Murder and the script of a biological child as a stand-in. Lana Turner's most prestigious Oscar should never have been awarded for any film, but rather for her performance at the Los Angeles courtroom in 1958. She appeared before hundreds of reporters not to receive an award, but to account for the death of her lover, Johnny Stompanato, the man who had lost his life in her bedroom just days earlier. Immediately after the killing, instead of calling the police, the first person to arrive was Jerry Giesler, MGM's legendary cleaner. He stepped into the room, saw the body, saw her trembling 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crane, and most importantly, saw Lana Turner's multi-million-dollar career standing on the edge of an abyss. During the 60 minutes of silence before the police arrived, an emergency rescue script was hastily written. Lana was an invaluable asset and could not be entangled with the law. But Cheryl was a minor. A child who confessed in order to protect her mother would easily receive leniency and the sympathy of the entire nation. And so the roles were assigned. The police recorded the girl's confession while the star mother stood there with an appearance so flawless it seemed almost unbelievable. Back in the courtroom, Lana Turner proved her status as a top-tier star. She stepped onto the witness stand in an exquisitely tailored black outfit and perfectly styled blonde hair. For 60 minutes, Lana was not merely testifying, she was acting. She sobbed uncontrollably, her voice thick with drama, as she described the moment her lover threatened to destroy her unrivaled beauty, and how her fragile little daughter had bravely rushed in to save her mother. The entire jury was mesmerized. No one paid attention anymore to the illogical details such as why the physical evidence was completely free of fingerprints, or how a frail child could overpower an 80-kilogram former gangster without any signs of a struggle. In the end, the result unfolded exactly as planned. Lana was acquitted amid applause from her fans. Cheryl was sent to a juvenile detention facility under the identity of the perpetrator. Ironically, just 1 year later, Lana made a radiant comeback in the film Imitation of Life, a story about a mother who chose fame over her child's happiness. Audiences watched and wept, yet few realized it was a near-perfect replica of her own life. In Hollywood, the boundary between performance and reality is as thin as a thread, and in this tragedy, the one who paid the highest price for a mother's stardom was the stolen childhood of her own child. 6. Fatty Arbuckle, the sacrificial victim cast out by Hollywood. In stark contrast to Charlie Chaplin, who was consistently shielded by the system, Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle was crushed by Hollywood itself to preserve the false facade of an entire industry despite being completely innocent. In 1921, Arbuckle was the undisputed king of comedy, holding the first $1 million contract in history. But that empire collapsed after a single fateful night at the St. Francis Hotel. When actress Virginia Rappe died from sudden illness following a party, the tabloid press found the perfect prey. They did not need the truth. They needed to sell newspapers. Sensational headlines wove a horrific narrative the obese Arbuckle had used brute physical force to assault the young woman. In an instant, Arbuckle became a monster. Posters were torn down, theaters collectively banned his image. However, the truth in court told a very different story. After 3 trials, the jury not only acquitted Arbuckle, but also took an unprecedented step by issuing a formal written apology. The judge personally handed him a statement signed by all 12 jurors. Acquittal is not enough. You were treated unjustly and are completely innocent. Arbuckle believed the nightmare had ended, but he was wrong. The court of law freed him, but the court of Hollywood did not. To demonstrate the industry's fabricated purity after a series of scandals, the moguls needed a scapegoat, and Arbuckle, newly vindicated, was chosen as the sacrifice. His name was permanently erased from major projects. To survive, the $1 million genius was forced to direct in secrecy under a bitter pseudonym, William Goodrich. This was a cruel wordplay on "will be good." Imagine the humiliation of a legend forced to hide behind an alias, bowing his head to a crime he never committed simply to be allowed to continue working. In 1933, after 12 years living in the shadows, the final ban was lifted. Holding a new contract from Warner Brothers in his hands, Arbuckle exclaimed, "This is the happiest day of my life." But his heart was already exhausted. He died that very night at the age of 46, just hours after reclaiming his identity. They said he died of heart disease, but in truth that heart had shattered 12 years earlier from the betrayal of the very place he once belonged to. 7. Judy Garland, a victim of chemical exploitation. They made us work day and night without rest. They gave us pills to keep us standing, then gave us pills to knock us down. After 72 hours of non-stop work, I felt as if I were floating in midair. That chilling confession appears in the memoir Judy Garland, an autobiography exposing the brutal formula for manufacturing stars behind the iron gates of MGM. Imagine a 16-year-old girl in her formative years whose lunch tray was always empty. In front of Judy were only watery soup-strong coffee and packs of cigarettes. She had to smoke 80 cigarettes a day to deceive hunger just to maintain the waistline of the character Dorothy. But how could an empty body dance for 18 continuous hours under the blazing heat of studio lights? The answer lay in the pockets of the studio doctors. They turned her body into a chemical laboratory. When Judy's eyes drooped from exhaustion, they placed energy candies into her hands, in reality, amphetamines. Minutes later, her heart raced violently. Her legs moved automatically like a puppet on strings, tireless for 3 days and nights. And when the lights went out to forcibly stop the violently trembling machine, they threw high-dose sleeping pills at her. Thus, Judy's biological rhythm was completely broken. By day she lived on artificial euphoria, by night she sank into chemically induced sleep. Studio boss Louis B. Mayer closely supervised this process, frequently mocking her as a little fat hunchback to crush the young star's self-esteem. This brutal control even stripped her of the right to motherhood. In 1941, when Judy became pregnant at the age of 19, MGM considered it a technical error. A pregnant Dorothy would shatter the innocent image. There were no congratulations, only a cold command. She was put into a black car and driven straight to a clinic to remove the obstruction, keeping the halo of fame untainted. Later, when Judy Garland died in her bathroom at the age of 47, the coroner described her body as worn and deteriorated, like that of an 80-year-old, the consequence of decades of chemical erosion. She spent her life guiding audiences to the magical land of Oz, yet Hollywood imprisoned her in a nightmare with no escape. 8. Thomas Ince, the murder aboard the yacht of the Press King. It was supposed to be the most lavish birthday party of Thomas Ince's life, held aboard the magnificent yacht, Oneida. But when dawn broke, the father of the Western film genre was brought ashore in a sealed coffin, and the cause of death shifted faster than the changing tide. In November 1924, press tycoon William Randolph Hearst hosted a celebration for Ince's 43rd birthday. The guest list was filled with powerful figures, including the king of comedy, Charlie Chaplin, and actress Marion Davies Hearst's much younger lover. The atmosphere on board was thick with the gunpowder scent of jealousy. The media mogul narrowed his eyes, watching every intimate gesture between Chaplin the clown and his own lover. Rumors spread that in a fit of blind rage, Hearst pulled out a cold object, a diamond-studded pistol, to teach the clown a lesson. A sharp gunshot tore through the quiet night in the middle of the ocean, but the man who collapsed onto the deck was not Chaplin. It was Thomas Ince, the unfortunate man who happened to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The truth was laundered with ink. The yacht immediately turned back toward shore. There was no police presence, no crime scene investigation. Ince's body was rushed straight to the crematorium with suspicious speed. The following morning, the true extent of Hearst's power became visible. On the front page of the Los Angeles Times, a rival newspaper, the headline read, "Film producer shot on millionaire's yacht." But just hours later, that edition vanished without a trace. In its place, newspapers across the Hearst empire simultaneously published an entirely different story. Thomas Ince dies of acute indigestion, later revised to heart failure. Not a single line mentioned a gun Charlie Chaplin or the head wound that multiple witnesses had briefly seen. Ince's wife, who had been preparing to raise an outcry, suddenly fell silent after receiving a massive trust fund from Hearst. Thomas Ince had produced hundreds of Western films where justice always prevailed, but in the final film of his own life, he was defeated by a force more powerful than bullets, the power of the media. 9. Errol Flynn, the rogue and the scandal with underage girls. In Errol Flynn's world, the law was not written in ink, but in enormous checks from Warner Brothers and the authority of a charming rogue's smile. At the Los Angeles trial in 1942, justice was bent according to a ruthless script. While two girls aged 16 and 17 trembled as they testified about being exploited aboard a luxurious yacht, Flynn sat in the defendant's chair with the posture of a king. He calmly adjusted his expensive suit jacket, occasionally winking at fans who packed the courthouse begging for his autograph. Instead of defending their client's behavior, Warner Bros.' high-powered legal machine carried out a public execution of dignity. The most damning proof of this depravity was attorney Jerry Giesler's cross-examination of the victims about the color and fabric of their underwear that night, implying they were promiscuous girls who had willingly seduced the star. The private diary entries of the two girls were dissected and distorted under a forest of camera lenses, turning them from victims into fame-hungry schemers, allegedly trying to extort an American icon. The irony reached its peak when Flynn was acquitted amid victorious cheers from the public. Immediately after the trial, the phrase, "in like Flynn," was born as praise for a man who could use fame to trample the law. Flynn himself did not hide his arrogance when he declared, "I prefer my scars to your medals." This was not the voice of remorse, but an open challenge to social morality. Commenting on the scandal, film historian Robert Mattson once bitterly stated, "In Hollywood, protecting a money printing machine is far more important than protecting a child." After the trial, Flynn continued his debauched lifestyle and grew even more reckless, knowing he was untouchable. Meanwhile, the two young girls walked away with an invisible sentence. They were branded as liars, shunned, and forced to live the rest of their lives in the shadows of contempt. Justice that year was burned to ashes under the flash of cameras wielded by blind idol worshippers, leaving a scar that would never heal on Hollywood's glamorous face. 10. Jean Harlow and Paul Byrne, a staged tragedy. The letter on the vanity table read, "My dear, this is the only way to make up for the terrible mistake I have made." Immediately, the world believed that Paul Byrne had taken his own life because he felt inferior beside his fiery wife, Jean Harlow. In reality, however, that letter was merely a prop planted by MGM to conceal a shocking truth: Paul Byrne may have been murdered. When the incident occurred, the studio's cleanup bosses arrived even before the police. They frantically sealed off the scene because if the truth were exposed, the public would learn that Jean Harlow was married to a man who had never divorced his former wife. This illegal bigamy scandal would have destroyed the career of the sex bomb Harlow, the studio's money printing machine. Suspicion of a personal vendetta surfaced through the name Dorothy Millette Byrne's legal wife. That night, heated arguments were reportedly heard, and a mysterious woman was seen hastily leaving the mansion. However, the studio quickly erased these traces from the records. They chose to smear Byrne's honor, instead portraying him as a man who sought tragedy due to health issues so that public attention would stop probing for the real perpetrator. The biggest question lies in the physical evidence. The gun bore none of Byrne's fingerprints, and the angle of impact on his body was extremely illogical, almost impossible to be self-inflicted. To perfect the cover-up just days later, the former wife Dorothy also died beneath the river's surface. The silence of the deceased helped the studio slam the door shut on the truth. Here, the honor of the dead mattered less than the studio's profits. Paul Byrne was executed twice, once by a killer in the shadows and once by the pen of the media to protect the halo surrounding the most valuable star. 11th, Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich, a secret love affair. Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich were two opposing mountain peaks. One was the mysterious ice statue, the other, the seductive steel rose. They were Hollywood's money printing machines, yet both spent 60 years performing a shared act, pretending not to know the other existed in order to conceal a same-sex relationship. In Hollywood of the 1930s, revealing a homosexual orientation meant the destruction of one's career. Therefore, upon entering the film capital, they entered into an unspoken agreement to erase their shared past in Berlin. The truth emerged only through the research of Diana McClellan. The ironclad evidence included the silent film The Joyless Street from 1925 and behind-the-scenes photographs showing that they had once been closely involved. Even writer Mercedes de Acosta, a mutual lover of both women, confirmed the relationship in her private writings. Look at the cruelty they displayed at Hollywood parties. Dietrich frequently wore provocative men's suits, but whenever she encountered Garbo, she would look straight through her like a ghost. Not a greeting, not a glance. This denial was so extreme that when Garbo passed away, Dietrich maintained a calm expression, as if she had just heard news of a stranger, even though she kept mementos of her Swedish friend in her drawer. The irony is that the world worshipped them as symbols of freedom, yet they themselves were imprisoned by fear of reputation. They had to choose between living authentically or becoming immortal goddesses. and Garbo and Dietrich chose the spotlight. They killed love to protect the empire Hollywood had built. A love affair buried beneath layers of silent ice became the most precious secret ever held by two of the most powerful women in the world. 12. Wallace Reed. A death from banned substances enabled by the studio. In the silent film era, Wallace Reed was hailed as the perfect American ideal. Yet behind that radiant smile was a body drained dry by a studio system that treated actors as replaceable components. Everything began with a train accident on the set of The Valley of the Giants, which left Reed with a deep head wound. Instead of halting production so he could recover, Paramount focused solely on the delayed shooting schedule. Look behind the makeup room curtain every time Reed collapsed in pain. Studio staff did not call for emergency doctors but handed him high doses of morphine. They did not need him healed. They needed him to stand up, step in front of the camera, and smile as if nothing had happened. This was not support, but ruthless complicity. His wife Dorothy Davenport later presented shocking evidence the studio continuously supplied painkillers so Reed would never leave the set. He fell into severe dependency, a tragic spiral that the angelic Judy Garland would later endure as well to remain under the spotlight. Both were pawns in the same formula, using chemicals to maintain perfection on screen. In 1923, when his body had been completely drained of strength, Wallace Reed passed away at the age of 31. Immediately, Paramount's media machine fabricated a story about exhaustion from devotion to art. They concealed the truth that it was the injections prepared on set that had pushed him into the abyss. Ultimately, the deaths of Reed and Judy Garland stand as painful proof that Hollywood was willing to trade human lives for timeless footage, where truth is often buried beneath layers of glamorous makeup. 13. Peg Entwistle, Death on the Hollywood Icon. You may have forgotten, but for fans of Peg Entwistle, September 16, 1932, remains an open wound whenever they think of their idol, the Rose who leapt to her death from the very symbol of Hollywood's greatest glamour after being driven into utter despair. Peg's bitterness began inside the executive offices of RKO Pictures. After persuading her to abandon the dazzling stage career she had built in New York with grand promises of stardom, they cast her in the film 13 Women. Yet during a ruthless content purge, the editors mercilessly cut almost all of her scenes. Peg, once a promising leading lady, suddenly became a nameless ghost on screen without a single explanation. The oppression did not stop there. At the moment she was most lost and vulnerable, the studio delivered the final blow by unilaterally terminating her contract. She was completely isolated. No money, no career, discarded like a broken prop once she had outlived her usefulness. The cruelty and cold indifference of the studio system turned a truly talented artist into someone with nothing overnight. Peg's jump from the peak of Mount Lee was not an impulsive act, but a final act of defiance against a dream-devouring empire. Immediately afterward, the media machine revealed its ruthlessness once more by collectively downplaying the fact that the studio had pushed her to the brink. They preferred to turn her into a melancholy legend to conceal the truth about a toxic working environment where human life was worth less than a faulty strip of film. The most bitter proof was the letter offering her a leading role that arrived at Peg's home just one day after her death. If the system had not been so callous, Peg could have shown. She did not die from a lack of talent. She was crushed by the cold indifference of an empire always willing to sacrifice people to sustain its glittering illusion. 14. The no pregnancy contracts of Hollywood. You often see the dazzling luxury surrounding Hollywood stars, but you would never know that behind it lies an entire system built on merciless clauses. This truth only truly shook the world when film historians and long-delayed memoirs exposed a brutal, unwritten rule. Motherhood was treated as a serious breach of contract. The truth emerged from declassified MGM documents where the powerful mogul Louis B. Mayer had established a regulatory army to control women's bodies. Under this system, every star was required to sign a morality clause, allowing the studio to terminate pay and impose career bans if pregnancy interfered with a seductive image or filming schedules. To the moguls, a pregnant belly was not a source of joy, but a technical malfunction that threatened profits. One of the most unfortunate victims named in this dark record was Lana Turner. In her memoir, Lana, the Lady, the Legend, the Truth, she exposed the horrifying moment when the studio forced her to undergo a procedure on a makeshift table, set up inside a dressing room without anesthesia, without compassion. The moment she struggled to her feet, the studio demanded she reapply her makeup and return to the set with a slim waist, as if nothing had happened. Another damning piece of evidence was reinforced by the case of Jeanette MacDonald. Records cited in The Speed of Sound reveal that when she became pregnant, the studio immediately arranged a secret midnight surgery to preserve the image of the pure songbird. The media of the time colluded deceitfully by reporting that the actresses were resting due to exhaustion, while in reality they were enduring emotional scars that would never heal. These secrets stripped away the true face of Hollywood, a place willing to trade lives to maintain illusion. The film capital built its empire by turning the wombs of its stars into corporate property, where the most powerful women were in truth slaves without the right to control their own bodies. 15. The Fixers System. Architects of Deception. Throughout these dark chapters, you repeatedly hear about invisible cleaners. In reality, this was a ruthless machine operated by two legendary names, Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling. They were the fixers specialists in turning crimes into accidents and molding scandals into inspirational anecdotes to manipulate public opinion. This system ran on power and fear. Mannix, with deep ties to organized crime, and Strickling, a master of public relations, held secret files capable of destroying any star. From arranging with police to erase evidence at murder scenes, to deciding who must enter sham marriages to conceal sexual orientation, and who would have their career frozen for disobedience, they created a brutal template for modern PR. Truth does not matter, control of information does. The curtain was truly torn open only after the death of George Reeves, the first Superman, in 1959. Although the case was closed with a ruling of self-inflicted, later leaks pointed directly to Mannix's orchestration to cover up a personal hit. The public was shocked to realize that the police were merely pawns in the pockets of the fixers. The full extent of this manipulation became undeniable with the publication of E.J. Fleming's memoir, The Fixers, and the release of MGM's declassified documents. The world was stunned by the scale of the deception. It became clear that all the idols people worshipped had been molded inside the laboratory of Mannix and Strickling. This revelation permanently altered public perception of Hollywood, exposing that the film capital was built not on talent alone, but on the iron control of shadows lurking behind the scenes. Mannix and Strickling are gone, but their legacy remains. They taught Hollywood a bitter lesson in a world of brilliance. The darker the shadows, the brighter the light appears, and truth is often the most luxurious commodity money can buy. The exposure of these cleanup bosses concludes the list of 15 shocking scandals stripping away the facade behind Hollywood's golden age. In Hollywood, truth is a luxury not everyone can afford. After the velvet curtain falls, what remains is not eternal glory, but shattered lives crushed by greed and ruthless control. The silent presence of these cleanup ghosts across decades serves as a reminder in a world of dazzling illusions. Darkness is always the catalyst for manufactured perfection. What do you think about the price of becoming a legend? Share your thoughts and do not forget to follow so we can continue uncovering the next shocking hidden truths together.